Welcome back to the CeltsAreHere weekly bulletin. I think this is now. It's myself, Declan McConville, joined as always by Quinny, and we've got our very own Ajax Sabanovic and Enda Coll. Enda, it's your debut today. Where are you joining us from?
I'm joining from Lucca in the north of Italy. So I've been on my travels. A lot of people have been kind of following it around. I've been traveling for the last 3.5, nearly 4 months now. So I'm sort of doing a loop of Italy at the minute. So I'm on my way back to France.
Very nice. It's absolutely teeming down a rain here in Glasgow. We're a couple of days away from the Champions League draw. I'm not jealous whatsoever. Quinny, how about yourself? How was the past week been for you? And is the weather much the same where you are?
Yeah, I'm in Glasgow, so it's been brutal. The weather over the last couple of days, thunder and all the rest of it. But yeah, I've been good. Had good fun at the weekend. Quite enjoyed managing to catch a stream for the Celtic game, even though it wasn't on Sky or whatever. So I actually get to see the game. Was a great Sunday and decent result. So yeah, all in good fettle over here.
Yeah, we've got plenty to talk about. It's the big week. It's the week we've been waiting on. Celtic haven't been in the Champions League for 5 years. In a couple of days' time, we're going to find out who we will be playing in the Champions League. We're already there, unlike other teams having to play qualifiers. And it's felt a bit weird, hasn't it, not having those qualifiers to play? And you can kind of see it impacting the team a bit. That, those early games against Aberdeen and Ross County, they looked like a team that were still, just coming out of pre-season rather than, circumstances that we've had before. We are going through those tough two-legged games.
Yeah, it's one of those weird things that comes with Ange Postecoglou is the preparation that has gone into this team. And this is the first year that I would have felt fully confident of Celtic absolutely breathing their way through to the Champions League group stages in the qualifiers. Maybe they might have had a difficult enough game in the final round, but it's funny that the anxiety of the summer doesn't really kick you coming into this season. And this season I've just felt really confident, calm, sort of like how the team has been prepared, just almost happy to get the season back and happy to get it back with a league game rather than a Champions League game, and almost building momentum into these games rather than going in having, maybe Starfelt coming in and being the first signing of the summer going straight into the first game. It's just not going to be like that this year. And I think the anxiety of that has been, not having the anxiety of that has been nice.
Yeah, absolutely. And Quinny, obviously, we're at that settled point just now with Celtic. It looks as though no first team players will be heading out the door. Obviously, there's been links with people like Chris Julian and possible loan deals for Mikey Johnson and whatnot, but we're not going to lose any big hitters. I think it's allowed Celtic that this summer to go and spend money, whereas I've usually hung off to see what kind of pot of money we've had. And we're in a really good position heading into this draw on Thursday, having now, went 4 games unbeaten in the league, 100% record, which has stretched that SPFL Premiership unbeaten record to 36 games, which is some run of form.
It's incredible, and I'm totally with Enda in that respect. Sorry, that not having the qualifiers, not having that kind of jeopardy through the summer has been fantastic. But again, just to kind of echo what you said there, like the business we've done off the back of it, because that's the main anxiety with these qualifiers. It's also, your season might, air quotes, kind of be over before it starts if you don't get the groups. But it's also, if we don't get the groups, we don't get the money. And if we don't get the money, we don't get the players, and it's like, we've got fires to put out. We've just sold somebody. So on like so many levels, like this has been the best start to the season we've really ever had in kind of recent memory, modern history, So in terms of coming into the Champions League, like I think it's one of these, we all like to kind of get excited for it and get carried away about how magical Celtic Park is and the kind of results we can have. And it genuinely feels like the first time for all those reasons I said and many more that, that optimism's got a good bit of foundation to it now, where it's like, yeah, we can get excited. There's something here,
And in terms of European football with Celtic, we've already seen an Ange Postecoglou team play in Europe. I have maintained in podcasts that I think Celtic getting to the Europa League last year was a bit of an overachievement at the point that we were at. I didn't actually think we would go through over AZ Alkmaar over a two-legged affair. The second leg was tense. In terms of just what Quinny's touched on, their foundations, did you see enough from an Ange team in Europe last season that you're confident that they can build off, your performances away to Ferencváros, even the home game against Bayer Leverkusen, where I think a lot of people thought that the scoreline wasn't a fair reflection? Have you seen enough to say that this Celtic team can go and make its mark in Europe this season?
In the Champions League, I'm not too sure. In the Champions League, I'm not too sure. In Europe, potentially, in the Europa League, I would definitely expect Celtic to do something this year if they do eventually fall back into it. In the Champions League, I think it's a bit of a step too far to expect Celtic to do much other than maybe get out of the group stages, depending on who we get in the group stages and what happens in the draw. In Europe last season, I was happy with what I saw with certain games like the Real Betis second leg, where Celtic practically had a second team playing and they still came out with a result. Bayer Leverkusen, yeah, they got torn to shreds a couple of times, but they were also very exciting to watch. I think I'm more excited to watch Celtic rather than expecting anything, grandiose from Celtic this year in Europe. I don't expect them to go and win the Champions League, but I do expect them to be one of the most exciting teams to watch. And I mean, at the end of the day, Celtic winning the Champions League is probably an unrealistic thing when you're going up against billion-dollar conglomerates like Manchester City and Barcelona, who are spending money they don't have. But what we want to see from Celtic is an exciting team performance that puts it up against these big teams. And I do think Celtic will definitely push some of these teams a lot harder than they have done in the last couple of years.
Yeah, I think that's probably a fair reflection at all. And Quinny, just in terms of that, do you think that possibly suits Celtic? I think European history likes to be the underdog, and maybe when you're not expecting to go and get the results might just come in some games through this group stage.
Yeah, but we definitely have a wee bit of that about us. I think we definitely felt that kind of sentiment at the end of the Brendan Rodgers group that we had with like Man City and Gladbach and whatever, because we did see that draw and it was a wee bit like, it's not terrible, and then obviously Gladbach rolled us over, and that kind of comes back to what Enda says, like it really depends on the group, in terms of like the group stage itself. It being a success is just like, if we do get a top tier team, they just don't absolutely embarrass us. Like that's a huge, and that might sound a bit like small-minded or whatever, but that is like a huge progression point, because they're able to actually go to these games next season potentially or whenever and know that, do you know what? We are on the same level as these guys. We just need to do X, Y, and Z a bit different or better. So I think, yeah, that would be certainly a huge improvement on where we've been. And I think Postecoglou, like you were touching on, Declan, with your question, like the experience he's gained last year. Sure, he's got a lot of tournament experience with Australia and Yokohama and that kind of stuff, but it's a totally different geography. There's totally different dynamics and things running on. So I'm having that kind of dry run last year, because there was a free hit, as you said, It's probably great, valuable intel for this year.
Yeah, absolutely. And probably, I think we actually touched on it last week, that the Bodo game was probably the biggest disappointment that we've had under Ange, because I think we expected probably so much more. But we've seen that they are a well-equipped European team, and with their results, they might potentially be, later on in European competition again this season, and want to keep our eyes on again. But maybe they're the kind of team you look at and see about building foundations that you talk about. Quinny spoke about last season's Europa League being a bit of a free hit for Celtic and Ange, developing his European style of football. Do you think that this Champions League group stage could possibly be that as well for Ange Postecoglou? It's going to become the very first Australian manager to also manage in the Champions League, which is an incredible personal feat for him. And I'm sure that's something that the whole of Australia is proud about, and that they'll all be behind him with.
I'm sure he probably won't pay too much heed to that. I'm sure that it probably means something to him privately, but I don't think he'll pay attention to that in a public sphere anyway. It is an opportunity for Celtic to play against the best teams in the world. That's what it is. And it's an opportunity for, let's say, take Joseph Juranovic as an example, who was linked with a move to Atletico Madrid. If Celtic play against Atletico Madrid, and they could well get them in the draw, and I fancy them to get a result against a team like Atletico, that is a sign to Juranovic to stay at Celtic, to develop his football at Celtic, to an opportunity. It's an opportunity to keep our best players in Celtic Park and not have them be stolen away by lower league, Premier League clubs, or even Championship clubs like Ryan Christie last season. That's sort of where I see it as, and a mode for Ange to sort of develop the game plan against the bigger teams, because a lot of the time over the last 10, 15 years, we've had a couple of big results in Europe and all these things, but we haven't moved forward in Europe. We haven't progressed in Europe. We haven't gotten any better. We dominated domestically, sure, but we were building for domestic football. That's what Celtic were doing as a club structurally. What I would like to see is this be a platform for Ange to say to the board, look, I'm the man in charge. I'm going to get you results. I'm going to build you a team that's big enough to compete at Champions League level, get all that Champions League money every single year. But you're going to need to back me, and you're going to need to get people in, get me resources, get me players. And to do that, he needs to get results. So it's almost a looping system that results on the pitch in this Champions League might prove to the board that if they back Ange Postecoglou properly, he will bring them not only football results, but financial results as well, because that's what they care about, really.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that makes a lot of really good points about Celtic building towards domestic dominance, which towards the end imploded in the board and ultimately failed towards that domestic, objective that they'd set themselves. And Quinny, talking about that platform that Enda spoke about there, I totally agree with him, and this been a looping process that I think for too many years now, Celtic have failed to find their level in European football. We've went from Europa League into Champions League, back to Europa League. That this now is about, proving to the board that, when you prepare properly, which we, you can say we didn't do last summer, but we got really lucky that all the new arrivals came in, they bedded in so well. We acted quickly in January, something we'd not done, in years. It's probably our most busiest January window for many a year, the most successful. If you act and prepare properly for the Champions League and give the manager the tools needed to go and make an impact, he can go and do it. And I think this is about Celtic getting in here, getting the money. There's been investment in the squad, and it's about progressing that again and looking towards getting the Champions League next year and progressing it further. Because if you think of that Brendan Rodgers second season, the big clacks, and I know some Celtic fans don't like us going on about him, but he was the manager the last time we were in the Champions League. I think our only marquee signing was Olivier Ntcham, and that was our building block onto the next season. Whereas what we've seen this season, we've brought in guys, who have went straight into the first team. That includes, Cameron Carter-Vickers and Jota, who weren't Celtic players to begin with, have came in, both big money deals. You've saw guys like Aaron Moy, who I expect to be used sparingly in the Champions League, or possibly quite a lot under Ange Postecoglou in the Champions League. And it's about just building on this campaign this season and looking forward to what Celtic can do and make a mark in Europe in the coming years.
Yeah, I make you totally right. And I think some of the results because I've never seen us be this aggressive in a transfer window, and some of the stuff we've touched on already kind of lends itself to that. No qualifiers, money's guaranteed, etc. But, and again, me and you spoke about this one, the first pods that we did on this channel, but even though, and again, I'm sorry to anyone that's annoyed at me bringing this up constantly, but we've not been linked to somebody like Vinicius Souza in the transfer market for ages. That was a real high profile, like defensive mid, wonder kid style guy that a lot of big players and teams were after. And, we've not been in that race for players for ages, And so for even the club and even the Edward Michu guy, I think he was in the first team for PSG the other day, I seen somebody saying, so for even the board to go, right, okay, well, we can sniff around this kind of market and let's see if we can make it work. Obviously it hasn't this time around, but I make you quite right. Like a great set of performances and proof of concept in the Champions League for Postecoglou this year. It maybe help us this in January post World Cup or in the summer, like push the boat out to get that marquee signing that we've just not bought in like 15 years.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's been nice that we've did business this summer, that you've brought in players that we really, really badly needed. In terms of those two kind of what you would describe lately as marquee signings, because it's just not like Celtic to spend 6 million separately in two players.
Yep.
But just in terms of that whole bigger question that we were asking about earlier on with Celtic building, in this campaign, both banners at each side of the Jockstein stand, the Lisbon Lions stand, are there to represent Celtic's dominance domestically of Scottish football and the team's triumph of being Kings of Europe, with Billy McNeil proudly in that banner holding up the European Cup. To me, that's something that should always go hand in hand with Celtic. I know Celtic's history in European football since playing our first game against Valencia in 1962 has had its ups and downs, but the point that we're at just now, and especially the money that's contained within the Scottish market, for Celtic to compete and do well, Europe is the place to be.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it definitely is, and it's where you want to be comparing yourself to as well in terms of where you are in world football. And it has been how Celtic and Rangers as well have compared themselves to world football, and how Scottish football has sort of appeared on the public sphere, because realistically, that's the only time that people are watching these teams. And I don't think since maybe the Martin O'Neill era, Celtic have really done themselves justice on the European circuit. They've had a couple of good games, a couple of big results under Gordon Strachan here and there, a couple of big results under Neil Lennon. And, 2012 was obviously a big game, and then the Lazio game a couple of years ago as well. But apart from that, it hasn't been consistent. It hasn't been progressing. It's been so long since Celtic have actually qualified out of the group stage and got to a knockout game. And I think that's what we need to change. Everyone loves talking about the atmosphere at Celtic Park, and everyone loves bringing up quotes, whether they're true or not, from Xavi and Iniesta and whoever. All these guys who apparently love playing at Celtic Park, Kyle Walker and, whoever. I want Celtic Park to be like it is always in European games, and that is absolutely amazing. But I want it to be somewhere that people don't want to come. Yeah, grand, the atmosphere is going to be electric. It's going to be amazing to play in. But I want them to fear coming to Celtic Park rather than, enjoy it. Fear it rather than enjoy it. That's what I want to see. I want Celtic Park to be amazing for two reasons. The fact that it has probably the best atmosphere in Europe when it comes to Champions League, but the fact that it should be a fortress for Celtic. Make use of that atmosphere, make use of the intimidation that you can actually bring to a football team by having 60,000 odd people screaming all the game. So I'd rather Celtic Park be a place that people fear than people enjoy. That's sort of where I want Celtic to be this season. Don't make it a nice place for people to be. Make it a really difficult place to go. That's going to be different to what you might have meant previously with Neil Lennon. Might have, bunkered in and got a result, sort of like the Barcelona result. But I think Ange is going to be all out attack regardless. So make it a fearful place that you're going to concede a lot of goals rather than you're going to have a tough night trying to get the goal into the net, ball into the net.
Yeah, absolutely. I have real faith in an Ange Postecoglou team scoring probably against any competitor they'll take on in the Champions League this year. And I think that fear that you speak about there is something you could clearly see in the Man City players that came that game when they're lining up. They're having a look about them. Celtic Park was absolutely in top form that night. Pep Guardiola's team were flying up until that point. I think they were unbeaten. I think they'd actually won every game up until that point, and Celtic, 3 each draw. Maybe a bit lucky towards the end, but still we gave them a right good game that night, and we want to see more of that. Quinny, just to probably conclude that chat around platforms and everything we've spoken about Celtic, do you buy into the idea that Celtic just experience European cycles? I know this is something that people are talking just now about Manchester United, that they had all that success under Busby, then the 18 years followed with relegation under Tommy Docherty, up until Ferguson came back, and now maybe experiencing that again, although the result against Liverpool might say differently. Do you think Celtic just experienced cycles in European football, as in through the 60s to the 70s, great success, through until, different big results in the 80s, 90s nothing, 2000s some big success, then a drop off, then back? Do you buy into any of that?
I think like post-millennium, like in terms of like football, we've almost had like the Industrial Revolution, like football since the millennium in all levels, coverage, statistics, every metric. I see guys doing training with brain scanners on their head. You know what I mean? Like it's totally changed. And I think like, like Enda was saying, under Martin O'Neill, like if you remember, the Seville year was the outlier, and it wasn't the outlier because we got to a final, but it was the outlier because we fell out the Champions League, if that makes sense. It was one of those years where
Basel,
we didn't
was it?
qualify. Yeah,
Basel.
So that's an outlier. Back then we were always Champions League, whereas since then the outlier's been we made it to the groups, or we didn't get beat 3 games at home, or whatever it might be, and we need to get. And so I think basically, for better or worse, the club and the board have kind of stumbled through in the darkness with a blindfold throughout the last 15 years, trying to like get us positioned with this kind of like industrial revolution that's kind of happened, if you like. And it feels like the platform that the club has made in terms of the squad now, like we were saying earlier, how aggressive we've been in the transfer market. Like this feels like the first time really, I say since post that kind of generation, Martin O'Neill and whatever, where we are ready to kind of compete. And as you guys were talking, I was thinking, I'm sure it was last season's Champions League, might have been the year before, but Salzburg had like a mad group of death, and it was like Dortmund and a bunch of our teams, and I think they got 12 points or something like that. And the thing with Salzburg, right, we all know that they're a talent factory and whatever, but they don't actually really spend much money. They just get guys super young, high prospects, and they just woo them. And they're like, come here, we'll look after you, we'll develop you, don't worry. We'll put you in Europe, we'll sell you to here, we'll sell you to there. And that's how they operate. And it feels like us in this transfer window, we've spent money, certainly, but it feels like the approach we're having. It's like, yeah, come here. We're going to play in the Champions League. You're going to have a great time. Come and join the party. And then again, like Enda saying, when you've got those guys that are exciting and they want to play on the front foot, that's how they got their results. Teams came into Austria, and we've done it in the past, and hopefully we do it again. And it's like, we're not going to set up shop and try and sneak a 1-0. It's like, first whistle goes and it's game on. We're coming for you. The crowd's bouncing. We're all singing and dancing and getting stuck into it. And it's feared. It's like, wow, what an atmosphere. But Jesus, man, like, you need to be prepared for Celtic, because they're going to come at you for 98 minutes solid, I think we've got the platform to do that now, finally.
Enda, do you buy into any of that cycle stuff? I mean, I think back to the AGM last year when Ian Bankier stated that Celtic could not compete with teams in European football, which he was met within the room with jeers, laughs, people, in abysmal shock to think that this was the mindset within the Celtic boardroom. It simply can't be the mindset within the Celtic boardroom. I don't think any of us are sitting here as Celtic fans thinking, "Oh, we'll get to the semi-finals of the Champions League and that will be a successful season for us." I think all we're asking for is to compete. And there's no reason why, as Quinny says, there other teams have did it, Scottish teams have did it, especially in European football, maybe not in the Champions League, but in European football, to go up against big sides. And we do seem a hell of a long way away from getting gubbed 4-1 by Sparta Prague only a matter of nearly 2 years ago.
Yeah, I don't buy into the cycle idea. It may have been true in the past, but at the minute, I think it's down to reluctance in the board to actually put together a cohesive plan in order for it to not be a cycle, rather than it just being a consistent thing. And Celtic and Rangers are in the most privileged positions when it comes to their league, because let's face it, they are the two super clubs in a league with, clubs that can barely afford to pay their proper wages in time for certain players. Yeah, exactly. We're currently in a league where a club are charging their season ticket holders €30 extra just to come into the game. That's the clubs that we're competing against in the league. Celtic have been always finishing first or second. That should automatically progress into European football, be that Europa League or Champions League, and they should be making the most of all the money that they get by reinvesting it in and making sure that it's a continuous cycle, rather than just being, okay, 10 years here, we won't do anything, but 10 years later, we might. There are clubs in Europe who are doing really smart things, like Bodo Glimt, who we came up against last season. They're doing really intelligent things because they sat down and said, look, okay, we can't compete financially with these teams, but if we actually plan this out, maybe 10 years we can. In 10 years we can. So maybe Celtic are at the start of a life cycle where they're starting to put together a plan. Maybe I'm getting too optimistic with what's going on, but that's what needs to happen. There's, between the data analysis, the different values you can get in the different marketplaces that other people aren't currently looking in, Celtic need to put together a plan to make sure that they're continuously in this and continuously dominate and continuously can bring in the best players, because otherwise the gap's just going to get wider and wider until Celtic eventually become a Conference League club, and that's what we're happy with. And no Celtic fan will be happy with that.
Yeah, we definitely don't want that, and I think no Celtic fan wants Thursday night football whatsoever. That's been something that's been frustrating, I think, for the past 5 years. You play Thursday, Sunday, it's not too practical. I think everybody loves a Saturday 3:00 too. It's a small minor thing, but I think it builds into just to be people. Ange Postecoglou's spoken about Celtic fans building their lives around following the club, and Sunday kickoffs are rather inconvenient. But I think Enda, what you say there kind of leads quite well into what I was going to say there, Quinny. If you think back to the Malmo team that beat us under Ronnie Dyler, they did a lot of scouting in South America. I think the team was packed with 3 or 4 Peruvian players, a market that obviously Malmo had looked at and thought, we can pick players up from here, we can develop them, and they'll do a job for us. Celtic scouting has been far and wide under Ange Postecoglou. That's been a real, key part of his success at Celtic. We went to Japan and brought in, 4 players from the J League that have been, all apart from it, Yusuke Deguchi, who we've not seen too often yet, have been revelations for Celtic. I think that's another important part of how we do this. It's about spending well, having what you say, Enda, a plan in place where you can look at markets that aren't being exposed and then go and compete with it, and then see how you reinvest into the team. Because, you know, something we don't want to do is sell players before their time's up at Celtic. But we know there's a lot of assets in that Celtic team. It's how you, whenever the time comes to move the big players on, that you reinvest the money properly into the squad. But back to that Malmo point, Quinny, you know, when we were saying about domestic dominance with Celtic earlier, I think round about that Ronnie Deila season is when you seen Celtic down tools a bit in European football, and it kind of led on from Neil Lennon's last campaign in the Champions League. I remember we get beat 3-0 by AC Milan at Celtic Park. I think that was a 6-1 game in a new camp, and then results like that became very, very common. Obviously, we crashed out the Champions League 2 years running under Ronnie. We get back there with Brendan, but the heavy results come, you know, against Barcelona, PSG. How do Celtic avoid these scalps that we were getting?
Well, I think kind of your point there in terms of where we're scouting has made a big difference as well. And that's kind of goes back to what I was mentioning a moment ago in terms of like the club kind of bumbling around in the dark for the last 15 years, trying to figure out how we establish like into this kind of new modern football, if that makes sense. We forget this quite a lot when we talk about football, right? But at the end of the day, when the whistle blows, it is 11 men versus 11 men. Now, they've got to be talented footballers and all the rest of it. But like you were saying with Malmo, it kind of comes on to what I was saying earlier about Salzburg and all the rest of it. Just because you spend 40 million on someone doesn't guarantee they're going to do anything. It just, you're buying a guy with high level and they've proven it on a stage already. But at every point in somebody's career, they transfer for 4 million, or most people anyway, you know, like 4 million or a free transfer. They're an up and coming kids and that sort of stuff. And getting those guys, IDing the right people early on has been the big thing for us. It's really held us back. Like we were saying earlier with like you were saying there with the Deila years and Strachan and whatever, these periods where we did do well were the outliers, because we were like, who will we buy this summer? Oh, there's a guy that's PSV doing all right. Let's just go buy Hesselink. And oh, there's a guy at Real Madrid. Let's just go buy Gravison. Why not? Let's just see what happens. And there's not been a coherent plan. And I actually really like the way Enda phrases it, that they were just building the team for the last couple of years domestically. There was no real thought of improving it beyond that. And we definitely seen that with the calibre of player that we settled for and didn't really push the boat out for. But yeah, so I feel like this season coming into the Champions League, we've scouted the right people. We've scouted from far and wide, and subsequently got these guys below what probably we would all call was a fair market value when you see the ability that they've got. So I think that's definitely an edge we've got this year that we haven't had.
Yeah, recruitment, I think, spot on, and building towards, you know, wherever you go. And if you think back to Salzburg, you're talking about the last time we played them with Yusuf Malumbu playing in midfield because we'd missed out and John McGinn. We'd penny pinched through another Champions League campaign. Dedrick Boyata, you know, spat the dim out before we played Athens. We get bombed out, and then you end up with Yusuf Malumbu playing in the Europa League for you with Jack Kendry at centre half. And I think that was the season also we brought Azagiri back. So, you know, if you look at all that as parts, that's not a team that's building towards any European success whatsoever.
No.
And you see that I was over in Valencia for that last 32 game in the Messiah. And, you know, Celtic gave a fair account of themselves. When you actually look through that Celtic 11, you know, compared to what you were up against Valencia, again in the January, we did nothing to...
Was that the game that Toljan got sent off?
Yeah, it's the very one. You know, we did nothing in the January. We brought in Timo Wee, I think, on loan, Jeremy Tolgan on loan, and Oliver Burke on loan. That was our January business, and a certain Marian Shved. It looks as if he could be on his way to Shakhtar Donetsk, but we did very little business. And again, it touches back on the point that you made, Enda, that Celtic have had full focus in domestic football. Probably as all were bad as well for, you know, getting caught up in the idea that 10 in a row and whatever else before it imploded upon us. And we know that, you know, since then, there's more to football than that. It's not just about domestic success. It's about, you know, building yourself as a, you know, we want to be a big European club. We've won the competition that we're in, and we want to go and prove why we've got every right to be there and be playing against the top side. So let's talk about some of those top sides, gentlemen. Pot 1, we've had the ticker tape going along. You'll have seen some of the sides. In Pot 1, we have the reigning European champions and the Liga winners, Real Madrid. We have last season's Europa League winners, who I'm sure we're all familiar with, on track Frankfurt. We then have the English champions, Manchester City. The Italian champions are back. The Rossoneri are back. AC Milan, Bayern Munich, who we came up against the last time we were in the Champions League. PSG also in pot 1, who was in our group the last time we were in. FC Porto, a familiar European foe for Celtic, of course, from 2003. And Ajax, who we seem to be drawn quite regularly against in European football in recent years. Gentlemen, pot 1, and I'll come to you in this one. What do you make of the teams in pot 1 in terms of the mixture, and who would be your preferred team out of that lot?
Well, I'll give you the teams that I don't want. Manchester City, Real Madrid, Bayern Munich, PSG. They're the 4 that I definitely do not want. So likelihood is we probably will get one of those. Look, they're in pot 1 for a reason. They're the champions. They're the best teams in the competition. I'd say Frankfurt are sort of outliers in that, based upon what we saw in them in Europe last year. My main takeaway from European football last year, especially Europa League, and I actually don't mean this as a dig to any of the teams, especially the other Glasgow team, but my main takeaway was that I couldn't believe how bad the teams were in the final four and the final. The standard of football was absolutely terrible. Frankfurt aren't really probably a pot 1 team. They probably did get a few results along the way that they might not have gotten if Barcelona weren't an absolute mess last season. And I think I'd fancy Celtic's chances against a team like Frankfurt. They're a defensive team. They're not going to score too many goals. They're not going to try counter-attack Celtic too badly. And that's the main thing that I would be scared of, is a team that either pushes up high on Celtic and presses really aggressively against our defence, or a team that's going to counter-attack us really badly with the lack of centre defensive midfielder coming in. So out of all the teams, Frankfurt is probably my preference. I would say Ajax is probably a good time to get Ajax in terms of where they are at. A new manager, obviously, with Ten Hag going to United. They've lost a couple of players, and Martinez might potentially lose Anthony as well before that game would take place. So, yeah, I'd say Frankfurt and Ajax would be my 2 preferences out of the pot 1. But I mean, it's an uphill battle against all those teams.
What about the Portuguese champions in Porto? Do you think Celtic could give them a good run?
They probably could. In terms of the level of the league, I think the Portuguese league is just up a little bit higher than the Scottish league at the minute in terms of the coefficient. So I'd say I'm not too familiar with what they've been doing in the last year or so. In the last 2 years, they've been pretty impressive, pretty strong in the Champions League. But in terms of the last year, I haven't seen too much of them. But in terms of the level, I'd say they're probably close enough to Celtic's level.
Yep, I think that's a fair summary. All those teams. Quinny, have obviously had Callum McGregor saying that he would quite fancy Real Madrid. He must just like the glamour tie. Hopefully he means that in the best respect, that we get the big team and 2 kind of what we would call easier teams out of pot 2 and 3. But what's your thoughts on this? We've saw Celtic come up against I think practically all of those teams in European football in recent years, bar on track Frankfurt. So we know what they're all about. But I definitely agree with Enda on that probably easiest route out of all of them would be the German Europa League winners last year on track Frankfurt, because they won that final against a Scottish team. It went to penalties. It didn't look as if there was too much between the teams, and I would imagine that Celtic would be quite confident about getting results against on track Frankfurt if that was the team that we're drawn against in pot 1.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. And Frankfurt have just recently sold Filip Kostic over to Juventus, and Kevin Trapp, the hero, is
Manchester United.
Man United, yeah. So they're definitely kind of shedding themselves for some parts potentially. But I'm on the same page as Enda. It's a 50-50 pot where they get somebody really hard like Real Madrid, PSG, Man City, or Bayern, or we get somebody who we can come up against. I think actually, Frankfurt aside, I think AC Milan, I think Ajax are definitely the team to stay away from out of the weaker ones, because Ajax are like kind of the outlier to what I was saying earlier. Like Ajax spend big money in replacing guys. They've just signed Bergwijn. They spent crazy money on Bassi. They've signed a guy called Owen Wijndal for left back, which is amazing. And in midfield, they've replaced Gravenberch as well. So anyway, I would want to stay away from Ajax, actually, to be honest with you, if I could avoid it from pot 1. And I'd much rather take AC Milan or Porto. Porto have been selling all their players like mad. All their real talent is gone from last year, certainly. And AC Milan, like in the forward positions, like they've signed Origi, and Origi will be probably really effective for them, but they don't have like that Neymar, Lewandowski level guy. Leao's quite flaky.
What age is Ibrahimovic now?
Ibra's like 38 or something. You probably come here for for an applause and all that, and a bit of
You might be
banter.
one of the quotes. Enda if we end up AC Milan again. I know he's played at Celtic Park before, but you could picture that happening.
That quote would be about himself though, rather than Celtic Park. But yeah, AC Milan got rid of Kessie as well in the middle of the park. He's their best midfielder. So, and to be fair, now when you're looking at these sides, pace is probably something that I'd be afraid of, because that's the real difference with Champions League and Europa League and Conference League, is the pace that the game is played at. And AC Milan aren't a pacey side. They're probably one of the slowest sides in terms of the forward plays, at least in that pot one, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, and again, but we've seen, a very poor Celtic team go to the San Siro and go 2-0 up against AC Milan and that COVID season. Obviously, nobody in the ground to see it. They'd won 3-1 at Celtic Park. They eventually won that home tie 4-2. But they're a side that, Celtic went up against and gave a fairly decent account of themselves against. So, yeah, I think
the best thing about Milan now is their defence. Mike Maignan probably going to be the France keeper by the World Cup. The left back's incredible, Theo Hernandez, and both the centre backs, Tomori and Kalulu, are like elite. So the best thing about them is their mid, really, the defence. Sorry.
Yeah, but they've not went up against Angeball yet, so if they do, they might not be.
They'll be tested for sure.
Be too solid. Are you going for that an easy tie or a glamour tie out of pot one?
I'd probably take AC Milan as the easy glamour tie.
Okay, that's a fair. That's a fair way of looking at it. I'm going to go for the glamour tie. I've always wanted to go to the Bernabeu. I'm going to agree with Callum McGregor in this, even though I'm probably going to sound absolutely mental. I would quite like to play Real Madrid, even though it probably wouldn't be the most pleasant of viewing for us. But yeah, if I'm going for the glamour type, Real Madrid. But if I'm going for the easy route, bring on track Frankfurt, because Germany is always a good trip. And I think out of those two teams, it'd definitely be one of the trips I would fancy. Whereas Ajax,
you kind of want to go. You kind of sorry to interrupt. You kind of want to go to the San Siro before they demolish it, though. So,
but that's another thing as well. The San Siro, so that's another one. But we'll still get into it in pot 3, so you never know. But Ajax definitely want to stay away from it. I don't think that'd be the most pleasant trips again for Celtic fans to go over there. So. After everything that's happened before. So we'll move on from pot 1 to pot 2. That ticker tape will come up along the bottom. We've got Liverpool, who, after what I watched against Manchester United, if they continue to have injury issues like they are, I would actually quite fancy Celtic against. Chelsea in there. But yeah, fruit result of the weekend, getting beat 3-0 with Leeds, but we know all about their quality. I think they're probably going to add a few more additions before the end of the window too. There's a lot of chat around Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang, obviously the link between him and Thomas Tuchel. Barcelona, I watched the end of their night. Lewandowski, top player still. Fati came off the bench and looked really, really good again. You've got Juventus in there, Atletico Madrid, Sevilla, RB Leipzig, and Tottenham Hotspur. Enda, come to you in this one. Are you avoiding the English teams in this right away? Or do you fancy an English team?
I would love to play an English team just to have a crack at them. If you're going to have a crack at any team, I think it's probably going to be Tottenham out of those two teams. And I know they're going to be improving under Conte this year, and they are better. They're much better than they were last year and a couple of years before that. But I think they still will be a bit Spursy. They still have a couple of players, although I do not fancy coming up against Harry Kane and Son. In terms of the teams that I do fancy our chances against, Juventus is one, Atletico Madrid is 2, and Sevilla is another one. Juventus have not had the best start under Allegri, and there's a lot of sort of not anger, but discontent, I guess, amongst the Juventus supporters at the minute with Allegri and the type of football he's playing. I saw somebody tweeted a screenshot of the formation they were playing. It was almost like a hexagon with absolutely no midfielders playing there at all. They were just all spread out. So I fancy, if that's how they're going to be playing throughout the season, I fancy Celtic's midfield and inverted fullbacks to do some damage against that Juventus side. Atletico Madrid, for the reason that they're not going to be a team that come out and press us high and put us under pressure. They're defensively minded and might settle for a draw against Celtic at home. And then Sevilla are probably the weakest team in the pot 2 altogether, although they do have a good coach and they're always fairly decent in Europe. Out of that pot 2, I think those are the 3 weakest sides. And then if I had to choose an English side, I'd go for Spurs, although I don't think Quinny agrees with that one.
Yeah, I would
I
actually go for Spurs. I would actually go for Spurs as well, just because I want to see these pints that fill up for the bottom. By the way, nothing about the football. Just fancy trying them. Quinny, come to you. You looked horrified when Enda said he would fancy Spurs out of them.
I think Spurs are scarier than most of the other teams in that pot, to be honest with you. I think Spurs are like mean now, you know, like the way they've recruited, the way Conte's got them going. And I think when it comes to Europe, like Conte is a kind of ruthless guy. He's not going to show up to games at Parkhead and just play this, you know, second string and try and win 1-0 or something, you know.
You could imagine Ange annoying Conte and Simeone though, couldn't you? I mean,
Yeah, well,
we're
that'd be
reading
class. El
Ange
Cholo and
Postecoglou's
Ange.
book. The Holland Australia game, he managed to get the better of Louis Van Halen, and Van Gaal refused to shake his hand towards the end of the game, which he said he didn't care about, and he was glad that he'd basically get the better of one of Europe's elite coaches. So sorry to butt in that one, Quinny, but I'm just picturing that Simeone or Conte getting really, really annoyed by Ange Postecoglou.
That would be good. But and again, I echo what Enda says about Juventus as well. Like, they've just sold De Ligt, of course, to Bayern Munich as well. So like Juventus are in a real kind of disarray situation. Also, they should be signing Depay. They've just signed Kostic. They've got Vlahovic, who they spent a lot of money on. So they do have like elite forward potential. But the midfield is outside the Locatelli. It's kind of absent. You know, they don't really have much going on. And then goalkeeper and defence are all quite substandard for what you'd expect from Juventus. But I'd probably disagree with Enda a little bit on Atleti. I've watched Atleti a wee bit this year, watched quite a lot of them over the last 4 or 5. And I think Felix and everything that's kind of going on there in the front lines now, they're still defensive and stuff, but I think like Atleti are going to be a bit of a surprise package this year. I think they're going to be, people will be saying, oh, they're attacking now all of a sudden. I think that's kind of the stage they've got to with the shape and everything. It feels like Simeone's maybe cracked that. So I think they're a team I would kind of quietly want to avoid just in case that kind of happens. Leipzig I would want to avoid at all costs. But listening to what you were saying there about like the Premier League teams, I think Chelsea in the group stages I think you can beat Chelsea in the group stages. I think they can easily fall asleep in the group stages for a game or two. And Liverpool's midfield is like, it's just done now. They need it. Yeah, it's just done, you know. And our midfield is the opposite. So I think we could give Liverpool and Chelsea a better game than Tottenham, which is why I was so shocked, because I was like, I don't see the same weakness in Tottenham compared to the other two, if that makes sense.
Yeah, certainly against Man United, you know, Milner, Henderson had absolute stinkers. Harvey Elliott looked like the only kind of creative force in it. Obviously, Thiago's out just now and whatever else. I think Klopp would quite like to sign on a midfielder. I'd be interested to see if they do make any movement towards the end of the window. But yeah, I think there's a lot of teams in there. There's potential that you probably could get results against, but you know, you never know with Celtic in European football. I think that's always a worry. I think you were probably saying Frankfurt's the team that you would go for out of the pot one. Who would you stick in as pot two? So you need to avoid any German sides. So Leipzig's out the equation. Who are you going for?
I would go for Juventus. I think they're the team that firstly can take these games for granted at times. They've got the players in there with that sort of mindset that they think they can sort of breathe through games. And the fact that there is some discontent with the game plan that Allegri is playing, that I think out of those teams, Juventus are a team that I think can hurt Celtic the least. So that's the team that I would go for.
Quinny?
Like I said to you last week, Declan, I cannot look past Seville. Lopetegui, great manager. Traditionally, as Enda was saying, also they compete well in Europe, but I don't think. I think Seville are the best team to get out of pot two, which kind of stopped me from the Real Madrid pick earlier.
Yeah, for just easy access for another trip, I'm going to go with Real Madrid and Spurs to make things interesting for Celtic. I certainly think we can get a result against Spurs at Celtic Park. If I was going for easier, though, I think I'd be going for it on track Frankfurt, then Sevilla. I think that would make up a nice wee group. And then pot 3, the final pot that we can look at. Obviously, one team in there is a TBC from this week, but we do have in there Borussia Dortmund, RB Salzburg, Shakhtar Donetsk, Inter Milan, Napoli, Sporting Lisbon, and our foes from last season, Bayer Leverkusen. Enda, come to you in this one again first. What do you make of that mix of teams? It's quite a few big hitters in there in pot 3.
Yeah, it would be. It's sort of like a Europa League pot if you look at some of the teams that are spread out, all the different countries that you have in there. As bad as this sounds, and it's going to sound pretty bad, you want Shakhtar Donetsk simply because of, you know, the situation that they're in as a club. Nothing really to do with them, but a team that, you know, have had to sell a couple of players and aren't getting to play properly in their own ground and make use of what's going on. I think that's probably the best situation that Celtic could get, is to get a team like Shakhtar, who aren't traditionally all that great when it comes to actually pushing forward. They always threaten to do so in Europe, but they never really do. Worst case scenario, I think, is Borussia Dortmund in that, or be Salzburg, because of the game plan that they put together. And you would like another crack at Leverkusen this season, even though they are a very, very good side. I think Celtic are better, much better actually, in fact, than they were when they played against Leverkusen the first time. Yeah. And Celtic did damage to them as well. So as a defensive team, Celtic are much better and much more secure than they were when they played against Bayer for the first time. So I'd probably go for Bayer as a third choice that I wouldn't actually mind getting. I think it would be nice to get a second crack at them, sort of like Fenerbahce or Ferencváros rather, a couple of years ago, when they kind of embarrassed Celtic and then Celtic came back much stronger again and completely controlled the game. I think Celtic probably wouldn't do that to Bayer, but they would be able to give them a better game.
Agreed.
Yeah, absolutely agreed on that one. Quinny, what's your thoughts on that pot three? I think, what Enda says there, it's probably right. It could actually be a kind of pot one draw for the Europa League with some of those teams in there in recent years. But what is your take on the mixture of teams that are in there?
Inter Milan's definitely the team to avoid. They're probably the favourites for the Scudetto this year. Lukaku, they're kind of doing up front what we're doing. They've got Lukaku and Lautaro, and then they bring on Dzeko and Correa, and it's just, it's the same guys, but they're, you can read between the lines, I'm sure, on that one. So I think Inter are just the team to avoid out that pot. Based on, when you seen last year, and I know they've signed some players, there's been some stuff going on, right? But when you seen how poor Dortmund were without Haaland last year against Rangers, for example, I don't think they're to be as feared. They've recruited very well this summer, especially in defence, it must be said, so they'll be much better. But they're maybe not quite as scary. But for me, I think Lisbon is the team to get. Again, had some good players recently. Just sold Matías Nunes, best midfielder, to Wolves last week, and they've had a few other guys, maybe less high profile, but they've sold some other bodies as well. And other than Shakhtar, I think they're probably the best hit. And again, I think Enda's absolutely right. Like, Bayer Leverkusen are not to be as feared as last year. Wirtz is out until January, so there's been no Florian Wirtz, who was the wonder kid who really pulled all the strings in the games, for anyone who doesn't remember. And so I think Leverkusen would be much easier. The only other team is Napoli. They've had a lot of surgery in their squad over this year, and Sinya's left, Mertens has left. The midfield's some upheaval. Fabian Ruiz is on his way to Paris Saint-Germain. Koulibaly went to Chelsea. So the whole Napoli team is really and Spalletti is, the manager of Napoli, isn't really known as being like a cool, calm, collected guy. He's a bit of a nutter. So their team is going through some changes and stuff. And they're so. Pot three can be quite forgiving, is kind of my summary on that, sorry. Just as long as we avoid Inter, but I would pick Lisbon, so we can go back there as well, and that would complete a very easy group that I've picked.
Yeah, listen, I am all for Sporting Lisbon too. That would be my pick on that one. Again, I think that's a great trip for Celtic fans, as well as I think that is a team that we could certainly get a result against at Celtic Park, try and get a result in Portugal, and then you're through into the Europa League. To have another crack at that. So yeah, I totally agree with that one in Sporting Lisbon, but there is teams in there like Dortmund and Inter Milan who you'd probably favour avoiding for the circumstances, and even Salzburg have started to become a bit of a well-established Champions League team. We know all about the damage they could probably do, and they're a team you probably want to avoid. But again, I probably agree with Endo and Bayer Leverkusen. You maybe fancy a wee bit of redemption against them. And as you say there, Wirtz is out. He's a player that pulled the strings for them last season. So listen, would it be a bad thing getting them again? Probably not. And see how far Celtics came over that year cycle under Ange Postecoglou. If we get a good draw in pot three, do you think Celtic can get out this group into the Europa League, Enda, yes or no?
I think they do. I think Celtic are Europa League standard, at least late into the Europa League as well. So at this point, that's where my expectations are at. I would be very disappointed, to the point of the almost Brendan Rodgers Champions League embarrassments, that if Celtic finished at the bottom of the group, that's where I'd feel is that I feel this team is better than that. They are a Europa League team at least. So the bare minimum for me is at least getting a couple of wins and getting into the Europa League, and then seeing what we do and getting, again, European football after Christmas is always nice to have, sort of like last year.
Yeah, Quinny, what's your thoughts on it? Obviously, Celtic haven't won a knockout tie in Europe since 2004. I think that's a monkey we want to get off the back swiftly. We'd hoped that we'd do that last season in the conference. I'm total agreement with Enda. I think if pot 3 especially is forgiven to Celtic, there's no reason why we can't be in Europe after Christmas, and looking towards us. The draw's favoured that we get past that tie, get that monkey off the back, and then start, a bit of a European journey, hopefully under Ange Postecoglou, not just in that season, but in the coming years to come.
Yeah, I think the draw would have to be pretty unforgiving for us to finish fourth with the quality we've displayed so far, and with as we as the chips lie before us and now with the teams that we're looking at, I think it would have to be pretty unkind for us to be. Yeah, I think we look good for it. Third, maybe first, maybe second. Who knows? Depending on how the draw goes and how the results actually pan out. Because sometimes these tougher draws, we've not really benefited from this, but we have seen it in the Champions League over the last 4 or 5 years. But sometimes when the group is a little bit harder, some of the smaller teams can work their way into third, even though there might be 2 or 3 big teams in there, because they'll just smash each other anyway. That kind of thing can happen. So yeah, I think the draw has to be pretty brutal for us to probably finish fourth. So I think we've got a good chance of getting by it.
Yeah, it's one to keep our eyes on. For a bit of fun, we did a bit of a simulator. I'm going to try this on here, so please do bear with me, and we'll see who we got in the old group stage draw. That should be it here. Can everybody see that? Okay. So we've went off to your left-hand side of the screen. You can see Celtic's down there in Group H, gentlemen. It came out in the draw with Manchester City, Juventus, Bayer Leverkusen, and we find ourselves at the bottom of our group. If it's Thursday afternoon and it's, say, 6 o'clock, I'm going to stop sharing the screen here. And that is the group that's came out, just to remind you, here, Man City, Juventus, and Leverkusen. The draw's probably still going on at 7 o'clock with the amount of rubbish that they have around the draw, with folk talking and everything else that they do around it, and etc. etc. But how are you feeling? Enda, I'll come to you in this one first. If that's the draw that's come out, you got the English champions in there, Juventus, who would sort about Bayer Leverkusen. How are you feeling?
I fancy that. I think Celtic can pull off a result against what would be a pot 2 team against Juventus, and then bare minimum probably get a draw against Leverkusen. Against City, look, it could either be 6-0 or it could be 3-3 or it could be, a score draw. I genuinely think that Celtic could potentially pull off a shock against a team like Manchester City if they were to score early and just sort of try control the game. I know that Matt O'Reilly has spoken about Celtic potentially having a different game plan and preparing that way for European football. So I'm excited to see what that is and to see if that'll surprise a couple of teams who have been scouting Celtic, because that's the thing about Postecoglou and playing in the Champions League, is that suddenly there's a spotlight on you. And I know that there has been a spotlight on Celtic because of how well they did last season. So I think they're going to need to pull off something a little bit more surprising against those teams. But I'd fancy Celtic to get at least 4 points in that group.
Quinny, what's your thoughts on that? I think that's something we didn't even kind of touch on earlier in a broader argument. You've got guys, Enda mentioned Matt O'Reilly there. O'Reilly, Kyogo, Maeda, Juranovic are all probably going to also be looking towards this World Cup. And this is a real chance for some of these guys to prove themselves on a big stage. And if a group like Man City, Juventus and Bayer Leverkusen came out, I certainly think Celtic could do a lot better against Leverkusen this season. There's no chance we couldn't give Juventus a good run at Celtic Park. And we know that Scottish and English teams always produce a decent spectacle in European football.
I would be hopeful we could get 7 points out of that group. I think we could get 4 off Leverkusen, I think we could get 4 off Leverkusen and then, maybe you get 3 at home, maybe get a couple of draws or something. But I don't know. I'd hope for 7 to 9 points, hopefully, with that group. Mm-hmm. I think City, like you say, City, it could just be 3 each in both games or something mad like that. It could be, if we are just, if they show up and we show up and we're like, right, guys, gloves off, let's go for it, It could just be a barnstormer. We could end up a draw.
Inverted fullback against inverted fullback and just go for a complete rammy. That'd be quite an interesting watch that. But again, I think if that kind of group came out, obviously we're just doing that as a bit of fun there, but we don't know what the draw will be. But it just shows you the way it can work. You can end up with, a real top quality team in Man City, and then probably what you would describe as one of the more favourable ties for Celtic and Bayer Leverkusen. We will be here to cover it all on CeltsAreHere. I'm sure there'll be plenty of content out after the draw is made. But we'll keep you up to date with what who Celtic's been drawn against throughout the group stage campaign. We'll have coverage on it. We'll be on here chatting about it. There'll be plenty of articles. Hopefully there'll be some video content around it. Sead Haksabanovic is in Glasgow as we speak just now. He's jetted in. It looks as if he's going to complete that move to Celtic, and it also looks as if Celtic's going to turn their attention to shipping Albin Ajeti out the door, as Chris Julian has also jetted into Montpellier. So there is plenty of movement at Celtic just now in the transfer window. Please do like and subscribe to the channel. If you've been watching, you can win yourself a signed Ange Postecoglou print. All I can say is, gentlemen, enjoy the draw on Thursday, however long-winded it is. And thank you both for joining me on the CeltsAreHere Champions League preview.